Well, a bright good morning from the greater New York City area to all of you, and good afternoon and good evening as well to many colleagues and friends we have joining us from all over the world. I really want to wish you all a very happy International Women's Day 2021, and thank you for making the time to join us for the next 45 minutes or so for what I think will be a very important conversation. You know, in recent years, I've come to really appreciate International Women's Day as a time to recognize the social and economic and political and cultural achievements of women everywhere, and also to appreciate the many women in my own life at every stage of life for growing and leading and achieving and doing so many things to improve our world. Today, decades of research have demonstrated that when we prioritize the empowerment of women, we speed development, we improve health, we drive economic expansion. There's a tremendous body of work now that demonstrates all of that, and there are also endless opportunities to achieve this kind of return, both small and large, and in the developed and developing world alike. And that's why I think the observation of International Women's Day this year is so important, because the effects of the global pandemic have dramatically set the clock back for women in the workplace, and women in the workplace everywhere have shouldered a disproportionate burden of job loss and many other negative effects, the health and economic crisis that's been wrought by COVID-19. So as we prepare to have this conversation today, it's probably enough to say up front that if we don't focus on this problem and on this opportunity to reverse the backslide, and if we don't organize ourselves well to address the impact, there will be a very problematic effect. Here in the US alone, I think it's estimated that as many as 2 million women alone could leave the workforce, and about 100,000 women in very senior roles in large corporations are also at risk. And that has, as we'll talk about in a minute, a very significant unintended consequence that's financial and cultural and has an impact on future generations. On the flip side, we can always make a threat and a weakness a tremendous opportunity. And I think that COVID has taught us that all of the risks, all of the challenges, all the problems that COVID has wrought also given us the opportunity to reinvent, renew, to respond, and to become better and stronger in so many ways. And I think that the conversation today is a lot about becoming more inclusive, more human, more creative in the way that we build and support our workforces. So today I'm delighted to have two leading voices on this issue to help us understand the roots of the problem as well as the actions we can take to address it. I'm really delighted to welcome Ellen Coleman. She's the president and CEO of Carbon. Carbon is an exciting new company in 3D printing. Prior to joining Carbon, Ellen was chairman and CEO of DuPont. She was the first woman to lead the company in its 200-plus year history. She also currently serves on the board of directors of Amgen, Dell, and Goldman Sachs. Ellen, very importantly and quite relevant for today's conversation, is the founding co-chair of Paradigm for Parity, and that's a coalition of business leaders and companies that are dedicated to addressing the corporate leadership gender gap. I had the privilege of working with Ellen when she led DuPont. In fact, she recruited me to DuPont probably about 6 or 7 years ago. So full disclosure, this is not the first time we've had this conversation, but I really look forward to having it again and in today's context. Ankur Kumar is an associate partner at McKinsey & Company. She's one of the lead authors of McKinsey's highly influential Women in the Workplace report. Prior to McKinsey, Ankur was director of MBA admissions for the Wharton School, where she also happens to have earned her MBA. H&K is one of the 317 companies participating in the Women in the Workplace study, and Ankur recently shared the results with me and our leadership team. So we're directly learning from our participation in this study, and I hope it makes a really meaningful difference for our workplace at Hill+Knowlton. Thank you both so much for joining me. Thank you to everyone on the line. We have a really diverse group of colleagues at Hill+Knowlton, at WPP. We have clients and friends all over the world on the line. Thank you all for joining. We're going to try to save some time at the end for your questions. Please submit them using the chat function. So I think it's important that we spend a few minutes to level set on the scope of the gender parity problem pre-COVID. And even before the pandemic, there was a significant issue for women trying to advance positions in different types of companies. So Ellen, let me start with you, because you can address this from so many different perspectives as a woman rising through the ranks to become CEO, from a corporate governance perspective, given all of your board roles over the last decade, and of course as the founding co-chair of Paradigm for Parity. So how would you characterize the pre-pandemic gender gap and the progress that was made ahead of the pandemic to address it?
You know, it's been interesting to look at the data and to get involved in understanding some of the root causes, because women are graduating from college at the same rate as men. Women are entering the workforce as the same rate as men. But with every successive rung up the ladder, women get less and less opportunities to advance. When you reach the highest levels, you know, less than 10%. I think 40 some women CEOs in the Fortune 500 today. And so when we took a look at DuPont, when I worked with you, AnnaMaria, and other opportunities to understand, we felt that there were a lot of things we tried, but not a lot made a difference. And it was like we were piecemealing it. You know, we would try to look at numbers. And, you know, when people would talk about, well, are there quotas? We would try to do training. But it wasn't until really, I think it was later in my, career as the CEO that I started speaking to other women leaders about this, other men leaders about it. And a group of us got together in 2015 and decided that if we didn't do something about it, no one would. And well, that was the formation of Paradigm for Parity. And what the research has showed, and we've spent a lot of time on the Mckinsey work and a lot of the other work out there in Korn Ferry and Deloitte and others, was that it really takes a concerted effort. It takes leadership from the top, tone at the top, and it takes a commitment to equality. And so Paradigm for Parity is focused on 50% of women in leadership positions by 2030. You know, we started in 2016 with 26 companies and now have 130 companies as large as Bank of America and Accenture, and small companies as well. And it's predicated on an actionable framework, on a 5-point action plan to catalyze change. And it really has created a community of people who work together, who share what works, who share how this can make a difference, who look at the metrics and are really driving change. And, you know, we can talk about the action plan, but it's been really amazing to see that a concerted effort working together, you can make a difference.
Ellen, thank you. And the companies that belong to Paradigm for Parity, they've committed to measure their progress, right? And they're sharing their data with each other and with the coalition?
Yes, they share their data. It is shared anonymously. We feed back to them their data versus the data from the rest of the coalition. As a matter of fact, I think we're doing that like at the end of this month. And commit to an action plan, really helping us build our toolkit for companies to use and create a community of people who can help each other make progress.
Great. Well, Ankur, as Ellen said, I mean, McKinsey and the definitive research really now on women in the workplace in so many respects. And I know Paradigm for Parity has drawn heavily on your work. What would you add to Ellen's comments?
Thanks, AnnaMaria, and thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone who's taking time out of your day for this important conversation. Just a few things I would sort of add to what Ellen shared, and just as context for folks briefly. So women in the workplace, we are now on starting our 7th year of this study, which is a joint research effort with McKinsey and Lean In. And so over the last 6 years, we've had a chance to engage with hundreds of organizations in the US and North America to better understand both their talent pipeline, HR policies and programs, as well as employee experience. And so maybe the two things I would just highlight are, one, building on what Ellen said, which is that there had been, as we saw through the research, modest progress made over the last 6 years in terms of increasing the representation of women throughout the pipeline. Most of that was happening at the top, at the SVP and C-suite level, where we were seeing, high double digits of increase over the last 5 years, but we weren't seeing nearly the same level of increase earlier in the pipeline. So some things to celebrate and some things to learn from, but certainly, many miles to go. And as mentioned, COVID sort of exacerbated, as we know, many things. I mean, first and foremost, it's a humanitarian crisis, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy. but it has also increased challenges for employees across the board. We know that there have been increasing rates of exhaustion and burnout, discomfort of sharing personal lives, blurring of work and home life, and women have faced that disproportionately. And so through the research, what we also know, and what we know without the research, is that not all women are the same. Women are not homogenous. And so through the research, we also identified that there were several pockets of women who were disproportionately affected even more so, particularly working mothers who were already bearing the working tax, or the double tax, so to speak, whose home care between child care and elder care and other responsibilities increased exponentially over the last year. We know senior women are facing challenges as well and experiencing burnout more so than in the past due to the number of things that they're shouldering, including often being an ally for women of color and people of color, and needing to sort of feel like they're always on. And we know Black women are also disproportionately affected in this moment. So historically also facing significant microaggressions, now also more often than not grieving the loss of a loved one and not feeling like they're able to bring themselves to work. And so all of that in total, as you mentioned, AnnaMaria, is leading to what we're seeing for the first time in the last 6 years, which is that women are expressing that they may be leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers in just higher proportion than men, which we hadn't seen over the last 6 years. And so as you mentioned, in the U.S., we're seeing 1 in 4 women indicate that they may leave or step down from the workforce, and that has huge effects, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and actually, I'd love to zoom in on that just for a minute, because I think we all sort of intuitively understand that this is not a good thing. Like, women leaving the workforce is not a good thing. But I think it's important that people, really understand what's known about the impact on value creation, that if this persists, that it comes at a real cost to business and to our ability to perform and create value. So what can we say quickly about the financial and performance imperative to close the gap and also reverse this COVID trend?
There have been many studies done, and it's amazing to me that over and over again it's been proven the correlation between women in the workforce and positive business outcomes. Credit Suisse had a report that showed that 50% women in senior operating roles these companies had a 19% higher return on equity. And the Peterson Institute has done research that showed as you move from 0 to 30% female leaders, you get a 15% increase in net revenue margin. So I know there's been many studies done, and yet we turn a blind eye to it. I just don't think we have kind of incorporated that or absorbed that into our thinking on how we think about our workforce.
Just a few other dimensions I'd add to what Ellen shared. So in addition to sort of the research that indicates that financial performance is absolutely positively improved by having gender and racially and ethnically diverse companies, Mckinsey also has done some research on this through our Diversity Wins research and have seen this as well. But this is also an opportunity for organizations to, quite frankly, attract and retain diverse talent as well. And so we know, in addition to representation and advancement, having cultures that foster inclusivity, that foster senses of belonging, also fare better in terms of their ability to identify, attract, and retain talent. And we're seeing, in some of our research, we've seen that 40% of people will turn down positions at organizations if they don't perceive those companies to be inclusive and sort of focused on that. And that's even more so the case for those who are earlier in their career. And we see that's even more important for folks who are, under the age of 30, as an example.
Yeah. I was a part of a CEO network conversation just last week where we were looking at actually the emotional and psychological effect of the pandemic and the mental health dynamics currently, and they're so profound. I mean, for everyone, it's very consistent that our extended remote work situation, all the stressors of the pandemic have created more anxiety and depression and sense of isolation. But there's a spike for women. It's really interesting, and it's also, I found it quite interesting that there was as much stress as mothers are under. There's a slight protective benefit that there was actually a data point indicating that women who aren't caregiving children at home actually have, in some cases, more significant psychological distress. So So I love the point that you're making, Ankur, that women are not all one group. That there is, we quite naturally are focused on women who have children and all the impacts on working mothers, which are profound. But there's an experience across the spectrum of being a woman that really needs our full consideration. Maybe with that, we can begin to think about some of the solution sets. And Ellen, Paradigm for Parity, you mentioned the action plan earlier. When you got started with Paradigm for Parity, I was so interested in the action plan because it was research based. I mean, basically, Paradigm for Parity focused on 5, principles, 5 key actions that companies could take and apply them differently, choose how they implement, but nonetheless, 5 directions of travel that are proven to make a difference in terms of closing the gender gap in senior leadership. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what we've learned about those 5 principles. And in this case, in response to COVID and the threat we're talking about, is it really more an issue of doing more of the same, or are there additional things we should be doing? The Paradigm Action Plan.
So first and foremost, it is about eliminating or reducing unconscious bias through frequent training. And it's not just one and done. And what I found out when I went through it with my team at DuPont is I was part of the problem as well. I mean, we have certain things we accept as part of a culture of a company that actually diminish and actually, segregate out certain people from certain types of jobs for a lot of historic reasons. And I think you have to be aware of them and continue to fight against it. That's a really important part of the process. I think it's an important part of building a good culture in a company as well. Secondly, I think you have to be committed to significantly increasing the number of women in senior operating roles. It's hard to get to 15% when you're at 10, but it's easy to have an interim goal that says maybe I'll get to 30 by 2025. And you have to actually work towards it. If you're hiring at a rate that's not at the rate that you want to be in your company, you're not going to get there. And it's not just entry-level jobs. There's a lot of people you hire at mid-level, mid-career level. Are you bringing them in? Are you bringing women, people of color in at a rate that is commensurate with what you want to see going forward? Are you promoting men and women at different rates? So this is data. This is understanding the numbers. And you need to, third thing, measure the targets at every level and regularly communicate the results. I mean, if you don't understand where you are, then you don't understand how far you have to go, right? And so, we at DuPont, we brought in a new head of HR, and he had a very simple way of thinking about it. The number you hire, the number you promote, the number you attrit, that's what you are. And we'd start every business review with a 1-pager that reviewed that for every organization. And in the beginning, it was really confusing. But amazingly enough, they picked up on it very quickly and could understand. They could explain each one of the trees, but they couldn't explain the forest when they looked at the overall numbers. So it's really important to have that as part of your cadence. The fourth is basing your career progress on results, not presence. So often I hear, and it's a real problem, that they're not given the same access to the informal activities to get to know the senior leaders. Women are. Mothers have parental duties that take them away or don't have the number of hours in the office, but it doesn't mean they can't get the work done. And so do you really have a blind system that doesn't look like hours in the seat in the office and really looks at the performance and the standards you're expecting? And last, and I think this is one of the most important, is providing sponsorship, not only mentorship, to women and people of color who are coming up through the system. Men have natural allies in the room when promotions are being discussed. Many times women don't. And so having that sponsor there, somebody that not only gives them advice on how they should develop, but somebody who's willing to say, this is what they can do, this is their development gaps, and this is why they should or shouldn't be considered for a role. I think it's really important to level the playing field when it comes to sponsorship in companies. And it's those 5 action plans that bring that together. In this period of time, I think sponsorship is the most important as we come through COVID. And making sure that you're reaching out and having those conversations, even though you can't sit down and have a cup of coffee or run into them, in the lunchroom, and really keeping up on people. Just that can really lift somebody's spirits and say, okay, the company is still interested in my development, even though we're all apart. I think that's a really important part of the connectivity that has been lost through the last year, through the pandemic.
Those are great comments. I mean, I think the point about mentorship and sponsorship and the difference between them is something that needs to be emphasized, and in terms of what we as individuals can do, and then we in positions of leadership can really focus on that advocacy, that sponsorship, that awareness, that focused, dedicated effort to think about the women in our organizations and how to advance them. I think is worth emphasizing. Ankur, that kind of brings us to how McKinsey clients are responding to the challenge. How are you advising them on this topic, and what patterns are you beginning to see?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would say, much like what Ellen described, what we see from organizations who are focusing on this and are able to do it well is it really is a constellation. And I include our own journey, right, as an organization in that. And there's a few key elements, just to quickly recap, because I think Ellen covered, a number of them, is really having that alignment at the top, spending the time understanding, collectively as a leadership team, your aspirations, so that you can then not just articulate it, but role model it, and then also cascade it through your organization is critical. Using data and information internally, benchmarks, we've kind of referenced a number of external research bodies, being able to leverage and pull those all together to help really shape the direction is critical, and set the aspiration that is appropriate for your organization and where you are. Everyone is in a different starting point and on a different journey. So using that to really ground yourself so that you can ultimately prioritize, right? We all candidly probably have far more work and opportunity and aspiration than we can do in a moment. So really being ruthless in prioritizing and understanding where are the critical areas to start and focus is part of this. So I would say, kind of all of those things together, right, form the basis of a DEI, sort of strategy, so to speak, or way to actually move the needle. A few of the things that were mentioned that I just want to sort of tease out in particular. So couldn't agree more with the conversation on sponsorship. We know women are under-sponsored and candidly over-mentored. We need both, but we need, as women, to have more sponsorship. And that often isn't necessarily happening organically, right? There needs to be thoughtful pairing of folks and understanding of individuals, both as a sponsoree as well as a sponsor. And so, absolutely seeing organizations continue to prioritize creating those formal and informal programs at the heart of it. Kind of also connected with that, Ellen, something you mentioned around, really looking at how you're examining and measuring performance. And that's something that I think in this particular moment, we've seen organizations work to make work more sustainable. We know that the flexibility that we've been afforded, we've seen it in our research, right, that's a huge bonus. But we also know that there's a number of challenges and taxes that we've talked about, the burnout, the exhaustion, the feeling the need to always be on. And so I think organizations have an opportunity to really continue to focus on thinking about how to leverage the flexibility that we now know that exists. We've seen that, all of our norms around how work happens have been challenged in this last year, but it's come at a price for women in particular. And so making work more sustainable by reevaluating goals and timelines, rethinking performance reviews. We've seen organizations do a number of things, whether it's shift formal processes to be informal, focus more on what you've learned as part of that conversation, or even in some cases say, we're going to give everybody the same review this year. Let's just remove the pressure of having to sort of address that piece of the puzzle on top of everything else. So those are some of the things that we've seen. I mean, I think the other kind of big theme is how to make work sustainable practically, right? Everybody's on videos, running from call to call, from video to video. And so helping organizations really help their team members and their colleagues structure their time differently, build in those breaks, do check-ins to kind of bring more of those human moments, those opportunities for inclusivity, for creating trust and psychological safety, so that people can feel comfortable to share what's on their mind, whether that's a positive thing or a challenge, to really enable the organization and the leaders within it to help solve those.
Ankur, thank you so much for that. It's going to be so interesting to see how this develops over time. And I think we'll have a chance, even with the time remaining, to reflect a little bit on some of the few things that we're beginning to see companies do and begin to communicate. in terms of a response to this issue. But before we do that, just a reminder to everyone that you can ask your questions in the chat room, and we're starting to get a few questions. We'll move over to those shortly. Before we do that, Ellen, I also wanted to look at this from a corporate governance standpoint. And how focused are boards on this topic right now in your perspective, and what role can boards, really play in helping to create the change?
I started on my first board in 2006. Okay, and back then, you had to pull the information out of the company. You fast forward to even 5 years ago, it's a push from the company to the board. They're usually committees, whether it's public responsibilities, public perception is taken into account. And it is around what the company's culture is, what the diversity statistics look like broadly, how do they know, what do their surveys of their people show, and it is a focus. And, what's their hiring look like, right? Why are you attriting so many people? Those discussions are taking place. They're taking place formally in the boardroom. And I think more importantly, they're taking place in the informal sessions, one-on-one with the senior leaders of the company on what they're doing about it. And it's interesting. When I remember one of the boards I joined back in 2016, I sat back and I waited to see whether it came up in the first set of meetings. And it didn't. And and so I thought, okay, do I bring it up or not? Is this the woman? And I wasn't the only woman, but it's just the woman bringing it up. And one of the male board members said, why didn't we cover diversity this time? We normally cover diversity. Why wasn't it on the agenda? And it was sort of like, oh, great, proud moment. It's like, and so there is a level of awareness. There is a belief that as a board member from a governance standpoint, we are responsible for asking the questions. It's management's responsibility to get it done, to set the tone, to create the culture. But it's our responsibilities oversight and to really make sure that their priorities and focus are in the right areas. So I've been very, very happy to see what boards have done in terms of helping companies focus on this and bringing to bear, opportunities or suggestions on where they might be able to find help or find some interesting ideas.
Yeah, great comments. Thank you. And, I would just add a quick embellishment from my own perspective as serving on a public company board. I recently did an off-season round of conversations with stewardship teams at some of the large institutional investors. And in light of COVID, so many of them are focused on culture and workplace and workforce issues. And it was really striking when I think about the time spent, couple hours spent in those conversations. I would say probably 85 to 90% of it had something to do with employees and workforce wellness, which I was delighted by and happy to have that conversation, kind of inspired by it, actually. And then I got into a group setting with, actually, it was AnnaMaria at Fortune who did one of his CEO roundtables, and I was in that a couple of days later after my last investor meeting. And Chip Berg, the CEO of Levi Strauss, and he's chairman of Hewlett-Packard, said the exact same thing. He said, I just completed a round of meetings and with our institutional investors, and they're really focused on employees. They're really focused on the workforce. They're really focused on the impacts of COVID and how we're responding. So, the reason for that is because it's at the very epicenter of value creation. It's just, investors care because it matters in terms of how we perform and what type of value we deliver to shareholders and to other stakeholders. So it's a highly material issue. And as a result, I think we're going to see companies responding in really creative ways. And even this morning, there have been some announcements made. In the run-up to International Women's Day, we saw some companies sort of stepping up and stepping into the breach and talking about what they're going to do. Accenture, which is a massive company, 500,000 employees, has started a pilot program in the Midwest with an NGO to look at hiring moms who are returning to the workforce during the economic recovery and giving them really meaningful leadership roles and focusing on their return, on their onboarding, and on their success. Verizon announced a new initiative this morning. So we're gonna track this. This is a good month. Women's History Month is a good month to keep an eye on this and to track it. And maybe what we'll do is we'll consolidate what we see by the end of the month and share it with our audience. And because I happen to be in the communication profession, just a quick reminder to everyone that good communication starts with listening. And I think that is another very important measure and not difficult, and something very deliberate that we can all do is to listen and structure some listening and listen in different ways to the women in our workforces to understand what their experiences are and how we can respond to them. I'm going to switch over now to the chat, and I see that we have several questions and probably a good 10 or so minutes to answer them. So one question is, each of you are successful working women. What factors do you believe were crucial for keeping you in the workplace, and did they change over time? Ellen, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. I think, first of all, it was, I really felt that I had good mentors and sponsors. At DuPont early in my career when I got there, I had 3 children, a set of twins, while I was at DuPont. And through that time, I didn't always like every boss I had, but I had a few who were tremendously supportive and sponsored me and knew that if I had to leave, I was going to get the work done, because you can't have 3 kids under the age of 4 and not have some stuff happen. But I really think that was a big difference for me. And, at the time, I thought they were each great mentors. I didn't understand the sponsorship part until I got a little further in my career, and I understood how they did go to bat for me to get some really interesting and key roles where I developed a lot, and I was able to build the skills that I think were really necessary for me to lead the company.
Thank you, Ellen. Ankur?
I'm smiling because I feel like I could chat about this all day, not because I have all the answers, but because it's been such a journey. A few things I would just share about my experience. So I actually joined McKinsey around the same time I became a parent. I have 2 amazing stepdaughters who are twins. And so I think about, shifting in major life moments and transitions over the last, decade or so. A few things that are top of the list for me. So absolutely, echo, what Ellen shared about just the critical role of sponsors and mentors. And I think also that journey to really understand the difference between sponsors and mentors and the asks of each of them, and the way to interact, I think, and what to expect, quite frankly, was a huge part of that. I would say a huge part of it's also been prioritization and clarity, and really being focused on the things that are critical for me, both in both those arenas. And I would say learning the art of saying no and turning down things, I think, has been just a huge part of the learning, and quite frankly, what's enabled me then to focus my time and energy on the things that are most important to me. So I think that's where the other piece, and that, quite frankly, is what helps your mentors and sponsors. The more clarity that you can provide to those who want to help you, I think, the more they can actually help you. And I think the other has been just, quite frankly, just being open to share my journey. It's not easy. I think, despite doing all the research and living and breathing this work every day, I'm still on a journey myself. And so I think just continuing to remind that we are, ourselves on a learning journey. We are learning in each moment. And I think just continuing to reflect on that and continue to play with my own adaptability and resilience has been part of what's enabled my own feeling good, at least, about, how I spend my days.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to answer the question directly at this moment because I think my answer leads us to another question that's been asked. And that question is, what practical and actionable things can male colleagues do to be better allies in the workplace? That question got 6 likes, so that has some energy around it. People want to know what men can do. So who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in here. I also saw that question, and I'm so glad you raised it, AnnaMaria. And I appreciate the desire for action. So here's the great news. I know we shared a lot of sobering information around the current state of women. What we also know is that allyship actually moves the needle. We've seen that actually changes the day-to-day experience, particularly of Black women. We also know that 2/3 of folks want to be allies, or they sort of report that they'd like to be, but the actions, right, really understanding what to do in a moment sometimes is what's the limitation between translating that intention into action. So a few concrete things. One is, AnnaMaria, you already said it, listen and learn. A really powerful question, how are you really? And then pausing to give that woman a chance, or that person a chance to answer, I think can be a huge part of just building awareness. The second is, continuing that education by surrounding yourselves and immersing in all sorts of research that's out there, not always relying on the women themselves to answer the question or to fill in the gaps. I think that's another critical step. The other is becoming more attuned to understand when there are microaggressions. Sometimes, quite frankly, they're not always easy to spot, right? They're sort of happening quickly. They're generally not intended. And so I think, really trying that listening to sort of look at the landscape around you and be an ally by stepping in. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily solve the problem or say more than, hey, I just want to check in. You made this comment. I think it might have been misinterpreted, or, it came across in this way. Is that what you really intended? Pausing to ask the question to enable somebody to help you better understand what they meant and to start a conversation or to enable a conversation, I think is a great practice you can take as an ally.
Ellen, what would you add?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It comes down to listening and learning and understanding. It's hard to walk in somebody else's shoes. But if you just take that minute, as Ankler said, and say, how are you? What's it like? Are the hours working? Are there things that we could do differently to make you more productive? I think are really, really important. I think the other thing is ask the question of the organization, right? Why don't we have a diverse slate here for this role? It's an important role in the company, and so by asking the question, you're not, you're enabling people to think through things that maybe they just were too busy and didn't have time to think about. And I think, making sure that's part of how you kind of engage and how you work within the company is important.
I'm just going to add a small flourish to this question. It's such an important one. It's one that I feel strongly about, because I think sometimes when we get into the milieu of International Women's Day, we talk a lot about women, and we should be talking about men, because men have such an enormous role to play in our progress overall and in the advancement of women. And and the question around what can men do to be good allies and sponsors, I would just encourage men who are managing people, teams of any size, to just be passionate about talent, to really be a great talent spotter, and to help that talent, break through and see what's possible, because it's not only women, but I think especially women sometimes might edit themselves. They might edit their own aspirations. They might edit their own ambitions and not necessarily see all the ways that their talent can be applied. So I've had a couple of men in my career who've helped break through to different types of roles and to take on more and to have experiences that I might not have ever sought, except that they saw my talent and they helped me. They helped me see what was possible. So anyway, my own personal embellishment to the answer to that question, and we're getting significantly more questions here. So let me just scroll through and see where we can go next. How will continued remote work after COVID impact efforts to create gender parity? This is a very important question. And I think, Ankur, Mckinsey's been looking at this. You want to take a stab?
Yeah, I'm only smiling because I think, AnnaMaria, you're like in my head. That was kind of one of the questions that really popped to me as well. I think, I know we're kind of running short on time, so I'll keep it really brief. I think as we've seen, remote work, or we've heard, it's felt like an equalizer, right? It's sort of leveled the playing field, so to speak. And so as organizations start to, or continue to move to hybrid work, to have people in person and continue to be remote, I think it's going to be, increasingly important for organizations to continue to bring that lens of DEI, to that. We're going to now have folks who are congregating in person and going back to meeting as usual. Are they going to remember to, get back on the VC to include those who are at home, as organizations, may be providing their employees with the opportunity to make a choice about, staying remote or coming back. We may see, right, as an example, women disproportionately choose to stay remote I know for myself, right, my kids are now back in school, my husband's remote. If I had to pick, I would probably stay remote because it's what's making my ecosystem work. But that could kind of lead to some of the challenges, right, of no longer having that equal playing field or disproportionately negatively affecting women. So I think it's going to be it's a really important question. I think something that we all need to be thinking about and planning for, quite frankly.
Yeah, agreed. I'm going to do one more question, but let me just say to everyone who's on the line that actually I will do a summary of today's discussion. All of you who have participated have registered, so it makes it easy for me to reach you. So I'll do a summary, and I will also address some of the questions that have come up that we haven't had a chance to directly ask, and I'll ask Ankur and Ellen for a little bit of help with that before I get back to you. There's one question which I think is very important, and of course it just got bumped off my screen. Hold on. Just give me a second because something got promoted. Okay. What are we doing to support women, the recruitment of women, given the step back the pandemic has caused, and specifically African American women? So I think we should be talking about the disproportionate impact on Black women, some of the drivers, and also some of the ways that great companies are compensating, addressing that need, and also ensuring that the talent pipeline is diverse. Ankur, how about over to you?
Yeah, really quickly, I completely agree. And I think what we're seeing is a few things. One, organizations really pushing themselves to find talent, focusing more on capability-led job descriptions. I think Ellen had talked about a bit about this before, really looking at processes by which you are identifying talent. So I think that's a big part, right? Making sure you're actually, identifying talent and pushing yourself in the ways that you're doing that. Secondly, and we've seen it in the research, this leakage in the pipeline that we've already talked about from entry level to C-suite, it's worse, right, for Black women in particular. And so continuing to do all the things that we've been talking about, right, I think is critical. But I think at the heart of it is really this focus on intersectionality. So pushing yourself as organizations and individuals to really think about both race and gender as you're building out your aspirations and your plans. Sort of my very quick comment on that.
I would just add, it has to be intentional. You have to have an intent to keep that going. It's just not going to happen on its own. And I think the more we realize that we really have to get intentional about women of color, around underrepresented groups, I think it's really helped open our eyes and understand that we can't look in the same places we looked before, right? Or we're just going to get the people that look like the people we already have. We have to open up our minds to look at recruiting in other places and creating new networks in order to be able to really bring a broader array of underrepresented groups into our companies.
Thank you. And given where we are here with about a minute remaining, I'm just going to ask each of you to offer any parting words of advice, either for women individually or for those of us who are leading companies, and anything you would like to add to today's discussion. And then let me share with the audience that as you're signing off in a minute or two, we're adding a slate or a slide to the screen with some that you may find valuable, including Paradigm for Parity and the Mckinsey Women in the Workplace research, but also a couple of other resources. And I'll be delighted to come back to you, as I said, with the summary. And through the course of Women's History Month, we'll be tracking how companies are responding to this challenge. So, Ankur, you want to kick us off with any parting thoughts?
Sure. No, I mean, just again, thank you all so much for being a part of the dialogue, for your great questions. And I feel really encouraged. What a way to start a Monday. Maybe just the parting thought is at a human level to continue to seek to understand, if you take one action today, maybe it's just going to a woman and asking them, how are you really?
Thank you. Ellen?
Thank you. This has been great. And I do agree with Ankur. Fantastic way to start a Monday morning in International Women's Day. And I would ask you to be intentional, right? To, if you don't have sponsorship in your company, why don't you sponsor someone? Get to know them, understand them, help them, develop them, and then talk about their skills when you have an opportunity to, in venues where people are maybe asking, hey, do you know of anybody that could do this job type of thing? So, I mean, it is about what we as individuals do first and foremost. And I think collectively that can really affect the culture of the company. And at the end of the day, culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's why there's so much focus on it today.
Such a fantastic way to conclude our panel. I can't thank you both enough. For me personally, it's just wonderful to have this conversation with you. It's great to see you both. It makes me feel great, makes me feel renewed and inspired and completely committed to making a difference and to doing that in my role, but also the amplification that occurs and the thoughtfulness that can occur through communication. I want to thank our audience as well. Please check out the resources. Keep an eye out for my follow-up to you. Enjoy International Women's Day and the recognition of women all throughout the month of March. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll be in touch. Take care. Bye-bye.